All right, we are looking at Unit 5.8, Research and Development. Pretty simple unit. The last one we'll be talking about in all of operations management for the year. And so when we look at Unit 5.8, we're looking at R&D. Again, probably some things that you guys can already talk about or do prior to this. All right, so let's take a look at the objectives. While it's pretty straightforward and self-explanatory for the most part, there are some big objectives in here and some really important information. So the first objective is to discuss the importance of research and development for a business. Being an AO3, you're going to need to be able to define what research and development is. You're going to have to be able to look at the positives, the negatives again, and come up to an overall judgment of how important it is for a particular business in the context of that case. And so being able to define but no positives and negatives is very important. When we look at the next objective, it's a really interesting one. When we look at analyzing the importance of developing goods and services that address customers' unmet needs, of which the customers may or may not be aware. I think that's the interesting part. So I think we can all again discuss why it's important to develop products, goods or services that address customers' unmet needs. However, the interesting part is we may or may not be aware we even want certain things, which is kind of interesting. Then we are going to look at, to the AO2 level, different types of intellectual property rights. These are copyrights, patents, and trademarks. This will connect back to our higher level balance sheet information when we start to look at intangible fixed assets as non-current assets. And so those are some things that will come back again in another chapter. And finally, distinguishing between incremental and disruptive innovation. So if you have a creativity internal assessment, creativity, I have several marketing internal assessments that are focusing on the lens of creativity. Some terms coming up in this last objective are really important to be embedding within your IA. All right, so discuss the importance of research and development for a business. So how would you define research and development? Well, research, another word for that is to investigate. We are investigating something. Development, we're creating. All right, so now research and development is a really interesting topic. A lot of students define market research and say that's research and development. However, market research is the front end of research and development. Market research is one type of research. In the research part, we have product research. We have a lot of different types of research that you can do. And then the development is actually the creation of goods and services. So why is it important? What are positives? What are negatives? Take a couple minutes to discuss or jot down, excuse me, just jot down a couple positives of conducting research and development and a couple negatives. So pause the video and take a couple minutes to please jot those down in your notes. All right, we will review those at a different time. This is a image of the top 10 spenders in R&D, 24, 25 US dollars, billions, roughly. And you also see that it is broken down by two major industries. This is one of the first times I think I've seen a list like this that does not include automotive. Automotive tends to be a really big spender in R&D as well. But if you're really looking at how our world is moving through sectoral change, you are looking at seeing the top five being tech firms, technology heavy companies. And then we have some pharmaceuticals, which again is typical of R&D spending. It's surprising when you look at Amazon spending, especially even in relation to Google's, which is Alphabet, the parent company that owns Google, YouTube. So you look at that and you see that spending in that billions of dollars. So 80, almost 85 maybe billion dollars, 85 billion, maybe exactly-ish on this chart. When you think about that, though, it'd be interesting to do some ratio analysis and really look at that percentage of maybe sales and maybe look at the ratio between them compared to some of these other companies. Because again, just by looking at the sheer volume versus maybe the sales or profitability of the companies. So very, very interesting that businesses will spend so much money on this research and development over the course of 1 year. Okay. So then the next objective is analyze the importance of developing goods and services that address customers' unmet needs, of which the customers may or may not be aware. We studied last year in marketing the difference between product orientation and market orientation. Market orientation is a marketing approach that uses research and development, or I'm sorry, market research, excuse me, market research to create goods and services. Product orientation is going to be that marketing orientation that actually creates goods and services that the business believes it can do well, and that the business puts it out there and assumes that if they put it out there, that the supply of it will create demand for the product. And so that's the of which the customers may or may not be aware, which I think is kind of interesting for the may not be aware part. Think of that product orientation. Think of that connection of, oh, what should we make? What can we make good? What can have high quality? And what can we put out there? But both market orientation and product orientation connect to this objective if we're looking at other syllabus areas. So why is it important to create products that address customers' unmet needs? I'm hoping first mover advantage comes into mind immediately when you hear something like this. We're looking at product development, we're looking at innovation, we're looking at creativity, not being complacent as a business. It's not the most economically sustainable model to keep the same products that we started with, but we also want to make sure we're meeting that niche. What is not being met for other people? What's that unfilled gap? And so that can be really, really beneficial for a business. But again, there's probably going to be a high failure rate. There's a lot of research and development money spent behind it. I thought this was just a little funny because when I was growing up, I had to listen to music on a radio. I had to take pictures on a camera. We had a landline at our house for a telephone. I had my alarm clock set every morning. I sent mail, calculator, all these devices now into one device within our smartphones, which I think is, again, showing how the world changes and it changes rapidly. If businesses don't keep up with those changes, then they are going to have a lot of problems staying relevant and having a sustainable business model. All right, so the next objective is an AO2, explain or analyze different types of intellectual property rights. Well, what does intellectual property rights mean? Intellectual property rights are the rights legally to things that you create using your brain. That may be a little bit simplistic, so please don't necessarily use that exact definition. But intellectual property rights are a non-current asset for a business. They are something that the business owns that's worth value, but it's also intangible, meaning really can't put a physicality to it. So the three you need to know for this chapter, and you also see this again back in the balance sheet chapter with an additional intangible asset as well, that will be introduced in another chapter. So we'll focus with these three first, and then we'll do the other one later. Patents protect inventions. Typically, they expire after 20 years. You don't need to know expirations and lifespans of different things, but patents typically do expire after 20 years to promote innovation. Typically, if you have a patent on something and you know it doesn't expire, you have it forever, there potentially could be a monopoly on a good or a service. There potentially could be a lack of desire on the owner's part to innovate and make it better. And it definitely would discourage other people to innovate because they wouldn't be able to commercialize off of it. So that's why they do expire. They typically aren't renewed, but can be if the business typically can show that a lot of the stages of the patent were in research and development years and not commercialized years. So patents protect inventions, copyrights. Copyrights are creative works. So you think of any like books, any music, any movies, film, artwork, poetry. We're really thinking of the creative works of somebody, and those protect that from being maybe downloaded illegally. That protects those from being used illegally. And they typically have a limited duration. depending on the country. I remember, I mean, it changed in the United States as well too, but typically about 70 years after the death of the owner. So the owner owns them, the death of the owner, then 70 years. They can even be willed to families. There have been, in our recent history, lawsuits on maybe songs that families have sued other artists and have won to be able to get money for that. Trademarks. Trademarks protect logos, symbols, phrases, images. Trademarks are really important for businesses. If you look on the right, we see a lot of different logos. You might see symbols, or it may be in the Just Do It for Nike, the phrase, slogans, things like that. Those do not expire, but you typically, as a business, need to renew them for a fee. Because those don't expire, the business has the rights to those. Now, I will say, all of these have been negatively, well, I should say copyrights and trademarks especially, negatively impacted by technology. It's a lot harder to determine if something is fake, maybe in a trademark, or a lot harder with copyrights in terms of, it's kind of easy to pirate certain music or download things illegally. And so that is illegal. There are laws to protect these companies that own these intellectual property rights. And so that is something that is really important. It also becomes more difficult with globalization. Different countries have different laws, and because they have those different laws, then what rights do the countries have or the companies have that are in a home country that has really strict intangible asset laws or intellectual property rights, and then to maybe one that doesn't. So again, that promotes some difficulty. All right, distinguish between incremental and disruptive innovation. Again, these are terms you're going to want to use and know, especially in internal assessment, creativity internal assessments especially. So let's look at a little bit of background. There's two main types of innovation, process versus product. And a lot of people don't realize it can be really innovative looking at a process of something. So when we look at process innovation, we're looking at how we do things. So for instance, if I'm a business that has consistently used a just in case method of stock control, but I decide I'm going to switch to just in time. That process innovation is we are doing things differently and we're being innovative and creative in how we do things differently. Product innovation is what you typically think of with innovations when you think of creating new products, creating new better technologically advanced products or whatever products you're looking at that you can do through product development as a business. So let's look at incremental innovation. This means that there's innovation, but the starting process or product already is existing. Incremental. It's not this large radical innovation. So we're adapting gradually. We're not making these crazy changes that are going to change the industry. And so when we look at the incremental innovation, you can see that we're taking something we've already started or somebody else has already started and we're adapting it. So there's just an image of different iPhones for product development. That is incremental innovation for Apple itself. That's a product innovation as well. I gave a process kind of innovation as well up top, a little bit about how you maybe do something or how you make something. And so at the left, I'm looking at Subway, and you're looking at Subway's model for decades. Then next, Chipotle, they really didn't just make this amazing, new, great, innovative idea. They took something, they changed it to make it fit their needs and their business model, and they did kind of the same thing, preparing the food in front of people, assembly line style. Again, process innovation. And then to the right, I have Bop, I believe. I think that's what I put. So Bop. So you can see that there, and then we can look at like Brassica or look at all these other areas that are doing the same thing. That is incremental innovation. Disruptive innovation is an innovation that is so radical that it actually changes the industry itself. So I gave a couple examples. I looked down at the bottom left, thinking of Henry Ford and the assembly line. That changed how cars were made. It changed how many, many products were made in terms of that mass production and that technical economies of scale. Top left, I have a Kodak film and a Kodak camera. And then we look at maybe like digital camera. Then we even can think about like our smartphones, really, really thinking about innovations that impacted industries. All right. So things that like when they came out, a lot of how things were done before were probably we're looking at differently at them. You think of streaming services and you think of maybe how we used to watch movies when I was growing up versus how you're growing up. You think of music, MP3 players, or look streaming music. That those are all different types of disruptive innovations on our history. All right, so there's a lot of thing that affects innovation and R&D, the culture of the organization itself, how risk adverse versus tolerant for risk are businesses, different experiences with the business, technology, even the industry that the business is in, the pace of change. So as technology advances, that's one thing, but also certain industries must move faster than others. Competitive pressures, making sure you're staying up with competition, and not becoming complacent in terms of sustainability. How much money we have, finance. How skilled is our workforce? Is our workforce able to come up with really great ideas to look at those ideas, to carry out those ideas? And then also steeple factors. Obviously, the externalities of what happens outside of the business are super important. You can even see some of these lists above are externalities. We look at technology as an externality, competition as an economic threat, typically. So those are things that affect innovation and R&D. This is just an article from 2022 that I think is really interesting, and it really shows some Kaizen with process innovations. So looked at Starbucks and how there was a wait time and looking at how can they make drinks faster, can they move the way the layout of the kitchen or not the kitchen, but the I guess equipment is so that they can get to things quicker. It's kind of interesting and really connected to the Kaizen piece of it and that process innovation. All right, there are your objectives. You can read through those. By this point, you should be able to write an AO3 on R&D, why it's important. You should be able to discuss why it's important to develop goods and services that address customers' unmet needs. You should be able to discuss different types of intellectual property rights, knowing that they're intangible assets or non-current assets as well, and incremental versus disruptive innovation. Additionally, with that one, you want to know the difference between process and product innovation as well.